our interest is in identifying a viable legislative strategy for the UK. So we're an organisation that's focused on the UK, although we share things internationally and work with people internationally. So I'll give a bit of background on Animal Think Tank, our mission, our strategy, and the sort of the context of the project. Antoni will give you all the detail about what we've understood or about political representation as a viable approach in the UK. And then I'll just pick briefly back up at the end and kind of suggest where we might be going next. Yeah, do you want to go to the next slide, Antoni? So formally, we started as Animal Think Tank 5.5 years ago, although the ideas had sort of been mulling around a few of us before that. And we were initially inspired by the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade in the UK. And this was very much a mass movement and a mass protest movement that organised hundreds of thousands of people. And we're very inspired by when we think of social change in the past and the big social changes that has always involved large quantities of people, either just knocking door to door, doing deep canvassing, very invisible, the more visible sort of mass protests on the streets, or just converting people one by one, your friends, your family, colleagues, your communities, and your neighbours. And we're very much, as Thomas said, we're informed by movement ecology. So this is not our concept. It comes from the Ayni Institute, AYNI. They're a US-based social movement organization. And it's one particular framework for thinking about how do different organizations, different views of change, different strategies sort of work in symbiosis with each other. Bill Moyet has a book, Doing Democracy, which takes a very similar approach, but slightly different framework. So as well as believing in the ecology, we also believe in supporting the ecology. And so we try to share as much as we can with other organisations in the UK and also to an extent internationally, and try to work and collaborate and partner with organisations in the UK. Do you want to go on, Antoni? So my background, as Thomas was saying, is in conceptualizing and delivering large-scale national infrastructure projects. So it's like building a new airport. Most of my time was building new rail lines, building a new parliament. So things that would normally take anything from 30 to 70 years to be implemented. And I was thinking, things feel very slow in our movement at times. But just before we started, I was thinking I worked on a project 28 years ago now, which was to build a rail link from the east to the west of the north of England, mostly using existing rail lines. And that still hasn't been signed off and yet is still regularly discussed in Parliament and in political manifestos. So things can be very slow, I think, in the corporate world as well as in social change. So I guess that's the kind of bias or the lens that I brought into Animal Think Tank is how do we conceptualize animal freedom and how do we plan and pre-plan for a strategy to implement that. So most of our work to date has been researching the concepts and researching the strategies that we might use. So everything you do in pre-planning phase. So our focus, we're probably best known for our narrative work. We published quite a lot on narrative strategy, different narratives that we can use, which messaging is most effective. That's both sort of our focus has been on sort of the general population, but you can also do sort of narrative research, narrative strategy, like within the judiciary or for people in policy, and what are the best messaging to use for your particular audience in your particular domain. what we're talking about today is sort of legislative strategy. We do also have a sort of a legal strategy, sort of strategic litigation project, and we're also interested in cultural strategy, which is probably the thing that well, definitely the thing that we've spent least time on to date, but do plan to dedicate more resource to in the future. And then ultimately, we're interested in organising, getting people, um, everyday people who care about animals, to volunteer, to be activists, to do whatever can be done to support a movement for animal freedom. So that's something we've recently started investing time in. So we just recruited somebody to help organise people within the cultural sector as sort of professionals, artists, museum directors, theatre writers, to see what they can do to bring about animal freedom by getting our narrative out there, by influencing culture, by influencing how we talk about animals, and sort of creating the conditions that will lay the path for a legislative or a legal strategy. So how these all combine is we talk a lot about shifting the Overton window, but then we never really talk about how do we shift the Overton window. So quite often we sort of like, well, we just bombard the press, the media, or social media. But shifting the Overton window is fundamentally shifting the ideas that we each live by, and then sort of that collectively shifts the ideas that we think are possible within society, or the ideas that we think society should be living by. And this is mostly done through narrative work. And that can be one-to-one conversations, it can be media, it can be social media, it can be going to a museum exhibition, it can be watching a play, it can be having a soap person becoming vegan in a soap, and then maybe becoming an activist, and then maybe taking the Liberation Pledge. These are all sort of different channels or vehicles for changing public discourse. And then that sets the stage for political strategy. And then lastly, it wasn't a sort of intention as we came in as Animal Think Tank, but I suppose we do spend a lot of time thinking about strategy, and spend time talking to people internationally. So I suppose organically it's emerged that we do spend time thinking about what's a movement strategy look like? So, how do we coordinate amongst ourselves? What infrastructure is needed? What meta organizations are needed? So yeah, our dominant one has been sort of narrative and strategy, and then the last two have kind of sort of at the moment a bit sideshows, I guess. Do you want to move on, Anthony? So the strategy work that we've been doing is we sort of consulted in the UK and looked at the different strategies different organisations were undertaking, whether that was implicit or explicit. Talked to legal scholars, political philosophers. I think we talked to about 60 people in total, and established that there are about 9 strategies at play in the UK that aligned with how we believed we could make a contribution to animal freedom. And so what we've been doing is looking at, okay, so these are objectives. If they were achieved, they'd each have different levels of impact for animals. And those are probably relatively easy assessments to make, not straightforward, but relatively easy. But if we were going to adopt as an organization one of these objectives, we really want to know, well, is it feasible? Is it viable? Are we going to get there in 10 years, in 100 years, or 500 years? So that's the project that we've been doing, maybe a year and a half, 2 years, I don't know now. So we've taken each of these and trying to build, by consulting people and thinking amongst ourselves, trying to build a strategy of how would we get there. So Anthony is going to be talking through number 2, which is what's the viability in the UK of pursuing a strategy for political representation? And then in the UK context, what would that mean for animals? Do you want to move on, Anthony? And so this is, I'm not expecting you to read this. This is chosen to be fuzzy, so you're not all distracted. This is the type of thing we're building. So this is a fairly typical strategy map. This is very high level. At the top, we've got our vision. underneath it in black, we've got a grand objective. So that would be like achieving political representation for animals. In red, we've got major milestones. So these are things that we might try to achieve every 5, 7, 15 years on the way to achieving political representation. And they might be concrete and tangible, or they might be narrative milestones, like we've shifted public opinion in a certain direction, which will enable us then to hit the next milestone, which might be concrete in achieving a piece of legislation or pursuing and winning in court. And for any one particular strategy, this is just like a thin slice of it. We've got about maybe 200 concepts that would contribute to achieving the end goal. So this is a framework of sort of grand objectives, strategic milestones, that comes from ICNC, so the International Centre for Nonviolent Conflict. And their framework is essentially have one grand objective that is normally might take you a generation to achieve, have strategic milestones that might take you 5, 7, 15 years to achieve each. They might go on in parallel or they might be sequential, and you normally have 3 to 5. And then underneath that, you have campaigns. So each strategic milestone might have a suite, a portfolio of campaigns. And then for each campaign, you'll have different tactics run by different organizations in different parts of the country. So what we're hoping to build to is at some point in the near future, we'll choose a particular strategy that we're going to adopt with an objective, and then we'll build a complete map for that complete strategy, and then we'll start collaborating with UK partners, UK organizations who are interested in pursuing the same strategy with us. So that's the context. I'm going to hand over to Antoni, who's going to talk through what political representation might look like in the UK.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you, Thomas, as well, for the introduction and for the invitation. My name is Antoni, and as Mark said, after this introduction of ATT in general, I would like to talk a little bit about our work on political representation in particular. Generally, our main goal with regard to this project is to define the place of political representation in the strategy of the UK animal rights movement and find out whether political representation is something that we want to focus on in the UK, and if so, how to best pursue it. And we think that the best way really of answering this question and doing research on the role of political representation in the movement strategy is to design what we think is the most promising strategy for political representation in the movement, and then assessing the impact and feasibility of that strategy. And to that end, we wrote a report on strategic pathways to political representation of animals in the UK. And in the report, we try to combine some theoretical insights with a pragmatic UK-specific mechanisms, capitalize on the institutional tools that are available, spot the opportunities and risks as well. It's generally work that doesn't lend itself easily to being presented because it's long, context-specific. It's really an overview of different options rather than just one argumentative piece. And I was thinking for a long time how to make this presentation interesting for you. And I thought that maybe, given that many of you will be working in similar sphere, rather than talking a lot about the contents, which is something I will certainly also mention, and we can talk about more in the Q&A, I could actually talk about our methodology and 3 of our research principles in this project, with the hope that this is something that could be also used by you in developing similar projects in your own contexts. The principles that I'll be talking today, I'd say are of the kind that actually feel quite obvious once you hear them, But for me, they only became obvious after a long process of experimentation and research. And putting these principles into work really changed how I think about this work. So my hope today is that even if these principles might seem self-evident, hearing them laid out might help you surface some connections or blind spots that are easy to miss when these principles are left unspoken. Um, and I would perhaps like to premise the argument or the presentation by still following up on Mark's introduction and mentioning 3 points on our priorities. Um, so the first point is that the ATT work on political representation really reflects our broader strategic orientation. So this is not an abstract exploration of what would be ideal in principle, but really an attempt to translate research into something that's an actionable proposal. And even though in strategy we draw a lot from scholarship in ideal theory, we're less concerned with ideal theory itself um, than with understanding how these existing non-ideal institutional systems could be reshaped to represent animals in the political processes. And for that reason, and this is really my second point, um, I think that any good strategy for institutionalizing political representation will be at least to a degree jurisdiction specific. So it must respond to things like political culture and history, identify potential allies, take into account the prevailing societal norms, etc., etc. So while today I try to talk about the more universal principles of strategy, this local context is and will be crucial. And I do hope to be able to discuss some more jurisdiction-specific UK examples with you in the presentation, but also in the Q&A after. And my third brief point is that there is a problem inherent in being practice-focused, as we are. And it is that this pragmatic approach can come with a danger of short-termism and focusing only on what's immediately feasible within this current reality and with the current framework, rather than looking at the broader picture. And I just wanted to highlight in the beginning that we are very much aware of that danger. And later on, I will say more on how we try to just creatively open up this strategic long-term playing field while staying grounded in practice. So this is still quite abstract and will be abstract for a little bit because I want to first give you an overview of the analytic lens we adopt in our strategy document. And this is a strategic lens that rather than being focused on individual reforms, concerns diachronic reform pathways. So our document, which we'll share with you later if you'd like to read it, gives an overview of a wide range of institutional possibilities, but it is not really a menu of standalone reforms to choose from. Rather, it is a diachronic here on the illustration vertical, this developing network of reforms with a set direction. And the difference between our work or strategy work in general and work usually done in the theory realm is that rather than discussing the merits of standalone options or standalone institutions, what we want to do, or what strategists want to do, is to discuss the merits of entire pathways. So we plan for evolution in a way and assess different strategies, not at a single point in time, but on a timeline, and think about the opportunities that certain strategies might create in the future. We focus on the leverage points. And perhaps this thought can be illustrated with a distinction. So in strategy work, we talk about two types of reform generally. One is the additive reform. So these are the reforms that are ends in themselves, are valuable in themselves. And there are also the catalytic reforms, which are the reforms that alter the strategic landscape for what can follow. And you assess these two slightly differently. So when assessing the former, you just look at the impact and feasibility of a given political representation strategy. So things are relatively straightforward. Um, but when you assess the latter kind of reform, the catalytic reform, you focus on the potential of the reform to alter the strategic landscape. And mm, our key learning, or at least my key learning in our work, was that almost any kind of reform, any kind of political representation strategy or institution will have both this additive and catalytic aspect. But because this catalytic potential is just really difficult to quantify, it is very difficult to ignore it. Although in the long term, it is the catalytic aspect, so the potential of a reform to connect with the future parts of the pathway, that is usually more important. And when you strategize, not in terms of standalone reforms, but in terms of entire pathways over time, you, in a way, automatically capture both the additive and the catalytic aspect of the reforms involved in the pathways. So, in other words, thinking of pathways over time lets you adequately assess the true potential of a reform without losing out on what's really important in the long term. I'm not sure whether it's clear at all, but my core point is that the impact of a strategy ought to be assessed over time, and it holds specifically more than in any other line of strategy work with regard to political representation. So you measure not the value of a single policy, but of a series of gradual interlinked policy changes. And this whole diachronic network of reforms, rather than just individual reforms, which forms the basic unit of analysis. Um, Now becoming slightly less abstract, I would like to turn to the issue of scope of action and explain how in strategy making we simultaneously operate across two different timeframes. Um, so here, essentially, I would like to suggest that we, when thinking about political representation, should reject sequential thinking and show how the moderate and the structural reforms can work in parallel. So in our discussions of animal political representation, we generally distinguish between these contained moderate reforms and the far-reaching structural reforms. The basic difference is that moderate reforms can take place within the current framework, whereas the far-reaching structural reforms, in a way, are incompatible with the current framework and necessitate some kind of paradigm shift. And these moderate proposals, so like in our work, it's, for example, the proposal for reforming what's called the Animal Sentience Committee or establishing an animal commissioner or ombudsman. These are more immediately tractable within the current political conditions. So they build on existing institutions, draw from established precedents, generally are more likely to gain political support, etc., etc. However, the problem is that they risk entrenching this minimal baseline of representation that legitimizes the status quo, but does not really shift the underlying power dynamics. And there are the more radical proposals. In our case, establishing the Ministry for Animals or having formal parliamentary representation of animals in the UK. And these have strong symbolic and structural power. They directly challenge our political anthropocentrism, but are generally politically remote, and so risk being dismissed as unrealistic, perhaps. So especially when discussed in political philosophy with an ideal theory, these big normative proposals for parliamentary representation of animals, for animal citizenship, might seem just so disconnected from the current reality as to, well, not lend themselves to easy strategizing at this stage. So you read about these big ideas as a strategist and think, um, well, okay, but what exactly am I supposed to do with these now? And it is perhaps quite natural to set these big radical ideas aside, to tackle when the where the right time comes, focus on the moderate reforms, and hope that these will later lead to the more radical structural reforms. Um, the thing is that most likely the right time to tackle the structural reforms will never really come um, unless we make it. Um, so if we focus on moderate reforms alone for now, without laying out the culture and institutional groundwork for these future leaps, we risk wasting some of the narrative, political, societal power that we accumulate during the reform campaign. Um, so what we think is, or at least I think, is that these two types of reform are actually not mutually exclusive, but could be mutually reinforcing, and therefore ought to be pursued simultaneously. So, in other words, it seems to us or to me that it is the wrong approach to think of the contained moderate reforms to be a matter of the present, and of the far-reaching structural reforms to be a matter of the future, possible and only after a paradigm change. In a way, the paradigm change is now. And what strategists need to do, I think, is to learn to operate simultaneously in these two concurrent timeframes, and pursue the long-term vision without really compromising on meaningful change now. And the challenge, especially with regard to political representation, is to identify reforms that are both achievable and paradigm shifting. So reforms that can be won, but also reframe what is thinkable next. And for that reason, I think it is incredibly important to be attentive to the reforms that may appear modest, but have particularly high narrative power on, or could offer some systemic points of leverage. And I think that some great examples of reforms that you have read about come from the work of Donaldson and Kimlicka, for example. So in the context of animal citizenship, what they argue is that the radical structure shift from the anthropocentric politics to a zoopolis can take place through small-scale local initiatives, which just slowly incorporate animals in our vision of community. And again, we have plenty of examples of these in our work, and would be very happy to mention some later and discuss these with you during the Q&A. Then for now, my third point, the last of the principles that I want to discuss before we get into the practical part, has to do with the structure of reform. My point is that no political institution is purely self-contained. And if we want to achieve stable political representation of animals, that will depend on the interplay between institutions operating at different levels and with different functions. So rather than thinking about individual institutions, we think about institutional systems. And when discussing our method, we talked about strategy being a diachronic vertical network of reforms, so network across time. Um, I would now like to show that any strategy of this kind also needs to be um, a horizontal network of sorts. That is a network across the entire institutional landscape. My point is that we should not design strategy with individual institutions in mind. Rather, we need to think in terms of institutional systems, because institutions, for their effectiveness, um, need to interlock. And for any kind of institutions, be it executive, regulatory, advocacy, um, its place in the system is equally important as its individual powers. Um, and it's the structural connections that really define the political institutions for animal political representation. So this is something we take into account in our strategy plan. For example, local representation. We talk about it in the context of welfare officers or regional commissioners, becomes much more meaningful when linked to a national network of coordination, information sharing, and oversight. We also propose the formation of something called the Department or the Ministry for Animals. But why our proposal is coherent, I think, is because it's complemented by a separate regulatory body that is something we call the Office for Standards of Animal Care. And perhaps one more detailed example could be interesting. So one of the institutions we propose is an animal commissioner. So it is the UK equivalent of what in animal political representation literature is usually called an ombudsperson. So a commissioner or an ombudsperson, as usually discussed in the literature, is simply an advocacy body. So an advocacy body which lobbies the parliament. But because the recommendations are usually not binding or cannot be binding legally, it is very easy to imagine the institution becoming toothless. So in our design, we aim to mitigate that risk by clearly setting the place of the commissioner within a network of interlocking institutions with diffused responsibilities. So, as we propose it, the animal commissioner would not only advocate on behalf of animals to the parliament or to any other body, but would be also paired with a dedicated parliamentary committee for animal welfare. This committee would receive its reports, oversee the work of the commissioner, and then advocate for uptake in legislation. But what is perhaps even more important is that we propose to use the precedent from the 2015 Wales and model the animal commissioner on the institution of the Commissioner for Future Generations, which is an actually existing institution in Wales. In 2015, in Wales, the Future Generations Act bound all the public bodies in Wales to consider the interest of animals in their ordinary decision making. And likewise, what we believe is that the animal commissioner ought to be set up by a new act of parliament, which would also impose a duty on the government or even on all public bodies to consider the interests of animals whenever animals are actually likely to be affected by the relevant decision. And the task of the commissioner then is not really to advocate only, but also to hold the executive branch accountable, for the compliance with this new statutory duty imposed by the parliament. And while commissioners on their own could potentially lack the power to compel the executive branch to follow any particular course of action, because we are talking about the framework. The commissioner is complemented by the Animal Welfare Committee, and the scrutiny of the government is the usual role of parliamentary committees in the UK. So in the design we proposed, the animal welfare committee would assess the government's response to the commissioner and would be attributed with power to secure the compliance or compliance of the government. So in this context, in the new institutional network, the animal commissioner becomes not really a general advocate of animals, but a key institution regulating what is essentially a constitutional mechanism, which explicitly represents animals in the political process. And this is, of course, an example. We are not really committed, at least not yet, to the establishment of the animal commissioner, and certainly not to the establishment of the animal commissioner in this exact institutional form. My point is rather that the institutional connections and mechanisms of interlocking cannot be just an afterthought. So they need to be included already at the design stage, long before the campaigning, and are necessary for any kind of strategy assessment. My other point is that when planning institutional reform, even at the very general level, we need to think about how to best profit from the local context. So in the case of the commissioner, we propose to base the solution on the existing precedent from Wales and leverage also the fact that the UK doesn't have a written constitution. So a simple act of the kind we propose would carry a major de facto constitutional change. And to sum up this part, I have been basically trying to say that our approach should not be institution-oriented, but systems-oriented. So we ought to identify how the combinations of institutions can amplify the scope or the impact or the efficiency of one another. And the emphasis that we need to place as strategists it's not really on just isolated wins on setting up individual institutions, but on assembling this institutional infrastructure, which where the representation becomes structurally embedded, so to say, in the political landscape, rather than just episodically achieved whenever we manage to form a new individual institutions with a limited scope. So that's all in terms of the theory, so of the principles. And I was just really hoping to be able to talk to you about our practice because what we present here is not really a finished framework, quite the opposite. And our goal is not to own this agenda, but to build it collectively with clarity about the options, but also about how to coordinate together on the path forward in the UK and outside. And likewise, it's a relatively new area of inquiry for us, at least. And so we'd like to ask you in the audience to help us learn. And also we ask for your feedback on our ideas, on the principles, and then on the institutions that we discuss in the report that I will talk about more if we have the time in the Q&A. Marc, over to you again.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. So I'm just going to take us a step back a little bit. So Anthony's been talking about how we've approached looking at political representation in the UK, and the work has been to assess the viability of pursuing this as a strategy. And as I said at the beginning, we've sort of been using the same methodology, the same approach to explore 9 different potential pathways. So as an organisation, we're not committed to pursuing political representation as our strategy. We're still sort of deliberating which of the sort of 9 objectives, 9 pathways that we've identified might look the most promising, both from a viability of strategy and then also what would be the impact for the animals in achieving them. So we're coming slowly to the end of that work. I think we've got six of the nine completed or almost completed. So we've got three more to go. And then what we'll be doing, me and Anthony and probably others around us, will be sort of taking a view, trying to make an assessment to balance the different possibilities against feasibility. And then as an organization in the long term, medium to long term, that's what we'll start pursuing. And so our work will shift from a sort of strategy research focus to an organizing focus. And what has shifted in our thinking in doing the research work, though, I think initially this was very much a piece of research for ourselves. We wanted to know if we're going to dedicate 20, 30, 40 years of our lives to this project, what's the best strategy? How can we best achieve animal freedom? I think as we've done the work, what we realised is that there's value to other institutions in the UK, both through just the dialoguing, but also through making explicit the strategic pathways and how things intersect, the different steps, etc. So my guess is at the end of the project, we'll have a bit of a step back, have a bit of a break from it, but then not only choose our pathway and how we want to pursue it and try and build some unity with organizations who in the UK are interested in that pathway, but also try and support then the institutions or the organizations um, that are choosing to pursue other pathways and sort of handing over the work that we've done in that area. Um, so yeah, like I said, it's a long, slow path. And as Anthony was saying, for me, both in my background, the successful implementation of large projects always comes back to the conceptualization of them. So this is pre-planning. Like we always talk about how to plan and implement something. But in the mega project sort of literature, where you have cost overruns of hundreds of millions or thousands of millions, um, which are projects I've worked on, or delays of 5, 10, 15, 20 years on a particular project, the root cause always seems to come back to how was the initial project conceptualized. So we could do decades of work to achieve an animal commissioner, but if we haven't got that network of organizations interacting with each other, and we haven't both like designed those accurately, designed the intersections accurately, but then also designed the detail of it, then we could face sort of big failure. Um, yeah, so that's the approach we're taking, and the big thing that I learned sort of professionally, um, which Anthony was talking to, sort of catalytic, can't you say the word change, is what I understood the role of a good project director for mega projects was not that they had their eye on the detail, is that they created the conditions of possibility. And on the first project I worked on, I remember one of the engineers saying to me, Mark, if we analysed all the risk, we'd never do a single project. And that really sort of stayed with me and then I observed, I think, project directors through that lens. They were bearers of hope. They facilitated, they enabled hope, and I think they enabled collectives of people, large collectives of people, sometimes to believe in the possibility of what they were creating and what they were going to achieve. So that is also part of our role as advocates, as people working in organisations, I think, is to create the hope and then the possibility and then the conditions for change.